Welcome to Keys to the Future, the podcast where we explore stories, insights, and ideas that inspire the next generation of STEM professionals. I'm your host, Gabby Coe. Today's episode is that I think every listener, no matter where they are in their career, will connect with. We're asking a simple but powerful question. As a STEM professional, what advice would you give your 20-ish-year-old self? We'll talk about the lessons learned, the detours taken, and the moments that shaped our paths. Joining me today are Maria Grundmann, an award-winning technologist who loves rolling up her sleeves and working through complex problems. She's spent her career helping teams understand big, interconnected systems, blending mission engineering, systems of systems thinking, and a lot of curiosity along the way. Maria started her career in missile defense simulations and has since worked across missile warning, sensor exploitation, satellite control networks, and renewable energy integration. JoElla Delheimer is a certified program manager and aerospace engineer with over 30 years in human spaceflight. She spent more than 2 decades supporting the International Space Station program, helping teams navigate complex 24/7 operations and design space systems. Today, she leads a ground-based science and cargo support services and loves sharing her journey from growing up in Oklahoma to becoming a proud mom, new Gigi, and lifelong shoe lover. Welcome, ladies, to the podcast, and thank you for sharing your expertise with the Keys to the Future community.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Awesome. So let's dive right in. If you could go back in time and give your 20-year-old self one piece of fun, non-career advice first, what would that be?
So mine would be to essentially what you said, really have more fun. Starting in college, I was so afraid of failing that, I was actually at the top of my class because I was working so hard at it. And I really wish that I had experienced college, more of the whole experience of college. And especially new in my career, I see a lot of our new career engineers who are on flag football teams or doing other things where they're creating a community that's connected to work, but not directly involved in the everyday work. I just think it makes you a more rounded person, happier person. And also it creates a broader community. So I would suggest that to engage in that fun. I've always thought I was an extrovert because I could talk to anybody, but I have determined that I am not. I am an introvert, and taking that step of joining those clubs and creating that additional group around my career would have added a lot of value.
Don't necessarily always look to yourself for taking the lead in fixing a situation. Looking back at my 20s, what I would have loved to have had an older, wiser version of me say is sometimes situations are just a little bit messed up and it's not really about you. Sometimes situations are wonderful and great and it's also not really about you. And there's less control than you might think that you have, less influence than you might think that you might have, which is on the one hand very freeing when there are problems and is on the other hand not as much fun when it feels like, no, I'm the reason that this group is still together because I've worked so hard to keep it together. And that it's okay to just relax and occasionally see how things go without necessarily intervening in a good situation or in a bad situation.
Those are excellent examples, and I totally agree. Having more fun would be one of my advice as well. But having said all that, what were your biggest dreams or expectations at age 20, and how have they evolved over time, over your career?
Absolutely knew without a doubt that my path was to become an astronaut for NASA. And I don't know if you've checked out the astronaut, roster lately, but my name is not on there. So obviously that has changed a little bit. One of the things that I learned throughout college, and this was at a time when we were just beginning to really use the internet to communicate more easily with other groups and other people who shared our own interests is that if I were to become an astronaut candidate just as an astronaut hopeful, I could look forward to not necessarily seeing sunlight on the faces of my loved ones because astronaut candidates spend so much time in training. And those who are selected to be astronauts similarly spend so much time in training. And I had been in high school that very studious, somewhat terrified student, Joella, who hadn't necessarily had very much fun. And it was in college that I learned to kind of blend that with a social life. And by the time that I left undergrad, I had resolved that that was not necessarily the career path that I wanted. I wanted something that would include seeing sunlight on the faces of my loved ones, that would not necessarily keep me away from them for so long. And so it was really towards the end of undergraduate that I decided not to go for the PhD in physics and to instead find other ways that I could bring my love of science and my love of people to bear in fruitful ways. What about for you?
Okay, so for me, I have to step back a little bit. You did mention in my introduction that I'm just a little girl from Oklahoma. I was a little girl from Oklahoma. I grew up just me and my mom. I'm starting to really recognize that whole idea of representation and being able to see people like us because my world was very, very small. I mean, we barely went out to eat. It was also before the days of the internet, those sort of things. I knew that NASA existed. I knew we had gone to the moon, but that wasn't even something that was like in the world of possibility for me. My mom raised me with a better life, was on the other side of college. But other than that, I don't think either one of us knew what that looked like. It was just a better life was on the other side of college. And then in high school, I was super good at math and science. And I went to a school where most people went to Votech. I had very little advice on how to go to college or, any of that. And I just got really, really lucky that I asked the teacher what I should look at because I was planning to be an accountant because that was the only thing you could do with math. I would have been terrible as an accountant because I am amazing at logic, but I am terrible at arithmetic. So anyway, he told me I should go be an engineer. And as far as I knew, engineers just drove trains. I had no idea that that was even a thing. So, I went to that college. Oh, and I asked him, I was like, what is an engineer? And he just said, it's what you are. So I went to a college day and aerospace engineering, that brought up this idea of NASA. And it was like, oh my God, what is that? It just kind of lined up, even though I still had no vision of what it meant. So, in my early 20s, here I am, I call it mid-college student, still in aerospace engineering, still surviving day to day to day. I still don't really know what this engineering thing looks like or what it means. I just love it. I also figured out in college, which got very lucky for me, that I was not a design engineer. I had a buddy that I did all my projects with, and he would say, okay, the plane ought to look like this and it ought to have wings like this. And then he didn't know what to do. And I did all the performance optimization, how much fuel it needed, how far it could fly, what the CG looked like. And then, when I entered the workforce, I got lucky enough to work in what we call mission integration and operations. And I got to work with international partners. And I was recently actually giving advice to a young engineer who wasn't sure he even wanted to be an engineer because he had also figured out that this whole design thing was not for him. So I guess the biggest thing that I would love to go back and surprise myself is that I really had no vision other than I just loved this and I wanted this. And then to find out that engineers are so many different things and there's so many different paths to take that I never imagined. I just imagined that you decided what materials to use to build an airplane or a spaceship or those sort of things. And, a little bit when I joined my current company, everybody here was a design engineer. And it was like, oh my God, once again, in my life, I don't fit in. I haven't fit in for so much of my life. I've always been that odd duck, kind of thing. But yet somehow, as the odd duck, I still fit. You know what I mean? And so I've been really happy here and that sort of thing. So you don't have to be there. Like you said, there really is no one path. And the other thing I learned from an astronaut is you can't follow someone else's path. You have to follow your own path and the path that gets laid out for you. And I think we'll talk a little bit about more about that as you ask other questions.
Yeah, I love that. I really love that. And I totally relate, Joella, to having my mom having her vision for us, for her children, was that education was the thing that we needed to concentrate on to improve ourselves, improve our lives going forward. And so that was kind of my motto as well: go to college and learn as much as you can. But I did not know what to do in college. When I was in high school, I was thinking that I would go into a career in law. And when I started to find out what that entailed, I was like, oh no, that's not for me. And then just like you, I reached out to a counselor and took aptitude tests, and that showed that I was good at math. And so they said, try engineering. Okay, let's go look at it. And through all of that process and starting engineering career or engineering major, discovered industrial engineering. And industrial engineering is optimization of processes and how can you improve what you're doing. And I fell right in and loved it. I had so many projects that, were so, so fun to do. And so in all of those experiences, I think makes us who we become later in our careers. So I'm curious, did your career unfold the way you imagined, or did it take a few unexpected turns?
At one point in my career, I was program manager of 300 people, multiple subcontractors, millions of dollars, and I remember the day they asked me to do that. I sat in the chair behind that big desk and thought, do they know what they've done? And somebody asked me one time how I got there, and the answer was that I had no plan to ever be a program manager. It was sort of like I had that idea of a better life was through college, but I didn't know what that looked like, so I dove in. Somebody said aerospace engineering, and that brought me a vision. I had a plan to go on to my master's degree, and somebody offered me a job to work with NASA, and so my plan was a master's degree, and instead somebody offered me a job to go work for NASA. So I took that leap and I went outside of what I had planned. And what I told her about my job to becoming a program manager was just, I tried to show up every day and do the very best job that I could do, be the very best version of myself, is which I kind of felt like I was doing in college the same way. I was just showing up every day, doing the best that I could. So there's that piece of it. But the most advice piece of it that I would give is that the hardest part is that as you're going along, doors will open and people will offer you the opportunity to step through the door. And oftentimes what's on the other side of that door is really scary because it's something you haven't done before and something, I don't know about me, like I said, just a little girl from Oklahoma. I'm not qualified to be program manager of 300 people, but my boss sat across from me and she thought I could. So, you know what I mean? So it's like, as the doors opened, I walked through them and there was something new and exciting on the other side of that door. Now, the thing sort of like what Maria was saying is that I've never given myself enough credit that I had something to do with opening those doors by showing up every day and being the best version of myself. And I'm not really trying to force it or not trying to live, like I said, someone else's path. If I was following someone else's path, I wouldn't have maybe not been my very best self, and those same doors might not have opened. And maybe that's not what the textbooks would tell you, because there probably is a path to becoming the right things to do, the right kind of jobs to accept. But my experience was just to walk through the doors as they open and to something that I didn't have a vision of. I never even imagined for myself.
Absolutely. Maria, what are your thoughts?
Much like with becoming an astronaut, every plan that I made appears to have made all of the deities in the universe laugh at me. At one point in time, I heard from my mentors and colleagues that I would make a good program manager. And so I thought, okay, well, that's what I'm going to be. And then as I spent more time in the industry, I found that kind of like you, Joella, I'm always the odd duck wherever I am. In a group of engineers, I'm the very outgoing one who wants to be on stage presenting whatever it was the group just discussed. And frequently, if I don't even mention that I want that, I'm the one who's nominated by the rest of the group to go be the one who's on stage presenting. And being in that typically more visible role, because it was something I was comfortable with while the introverts around me were not as comfortable with it, meant that there were many people who took notice of me and many people who offered me guidance throughout the way. And there were some opportunities that I was offered that I thought gosh, this is the greatest thing ever. How could I possibly say no to this? And others that, wow, this is the greatest thing ever. How could I possibly say no to this? But it just doesn't quite feel right. Or it's just not going to work if I want to ever get married to my very serious boyfriend who's about to propose. And there is no control universe that I can go back to figure out, well, did I make the right decision on that one, but maybe not on this one? And that all for me came to a beautiful sort of balance when my company at the time sent me on a 2-year, 6-month long rotation program where every rotation was one that I found and cultivated, or I worked my network in order to, find a door in. And where at the end of some rotations, I thought, wow, that was the best 6 months ever. I'm so glad I spent that 6 months here. And others ended with, wow, I am so glad that I only spent 6 months doing this thing that I thought was going to be wonderful, so that way I didn't end up locked into it for longer than 6 months, because that is not my happy place. And so where I've come to now is so long as I have the resources for it, so long as I have the bandwidth for it, to go ahead and try the something new, to reach for the something scary. And if I don't love it after those initial 6 months of I may need to give it another try, or I may need to look at it in a different way, then I can say, you know what? I did try that, and now I've learned. So even that failure is a success because I know what not to do in the future. I've gained what I could from the experience, and I'll never go back to that again. But in so many other cases, it showed me that, wow, you know what? I do actually have an aptitude as a product owner in an agile team. And I really enjoy using software to solve problems, even though I'm not a software engineer. I'm a systems engineer. But I see all the ways that we have all of these interconnections, and the way that software can be the connective tissue that persists and can be maintained. And so to my younger self, I would say that what may initially seem like a failure may in fact be one of the very best opportunities to learn, because smooth seas don't make good sailors. And for everything that seems like, wow, I'm amazing at this, I'm fantastic at this, I should always do this from here on out, companies have a way of noticing when you're excellent at something, and so they'll hand you greater and greater responsibilities in that something you're excellent at, until such point in time as you are forced to learn something new because it's necessary for the level you've arrived at.
Absolutely. And I love the point that Joella you made. Be the best version of yourself in whatever door you walked into. And I think that allows you to perform at a level that gets you visibility. And then Maria, you mentioned you got visibility because of that. You stepped forward, being the extrovert, as you consider yourself an extrovert amongst the engineers, right? Stepping forward to like do those presentations got you some visibility that led you to some opportunities that you probably didn't think about before that. And then the third point that I think Joella made, that people believed in you, and sometimes we don't see ourselves in a role, but we need to believe in those people that see us in those roles. Would you agree?
Definitely. Go ahead, Maria.
Yes, Maria. You go.
I just remembered, thank you so much for bringing that back to my memory, Gabby. One of the things I heard Adam Grant say once is in for the question of what do you do if you have imposter syndrome? If you feel like the responsibility that you've been handed is clearly an indication that people think far too highly of, you know, I have somehow managed to fool everyone into thinking I'm a responsible adult in this way. And he said, consider that they see untapped potential in you.
Right. Yeah. Even when we don't believe it. And then
Yes.
having
It's
the courage, right, to step through that door to that scary thing that we think, oh my gosh, I can't do it. But you will find that you will be able to do it because you start believing in what others believe for you. That's amazing. That's amazing. So looking back, what's something that you wish you had known about your STEM or the STEM world when you were starting out? Anything comes to mind?
sure.
Yeah.
One of the things that I wish I had known when I entered college was that being a minority in STEM, I ended up being the only physics major in my graduating class who
Mm,
was female, for example. And my goodness, there was no ethnic diversity whatsoever. Our school has gotten better since then, but it was not great then. I wish that I had recognized that that was not a problem for other people to solve earlier. It's something that came to me throughout my college career when the next year's physics class had more people than usual and also a very high percentage of women in it. And after spending some time with that next year's class and the classes that we had together, I realized that we all essentially shared the same personality. The men might be shy or they might be extroverted, they might be opinionated or they might be reserved, but all of the women were very opinionated, were very outgoing, and were very happy to explain exactly what our opinions were and why they were right. And that was when I really started looking into the causes of the leaky pipeline. Both for women in STEM and also for people of color in STEM. And that was when I really began more of a systems view of understanding how STEM as a community does not necessarily always live up to even its own desires, much less its own values in terms of the impact that we have and what we could do about it in order to change that. Because prior to that time, I'd heard that there weren't as many women in science and mathematics, but I had just looked at it as, oh, well, that's okay. I like science. I like
mm,
mathematics. I'm good at them. So that's not a problem for me individually. And I hadn't necessarily looked at my responsibility in helping the women who might be more shy and more retiring to feel just as home in the physics department as I felt.
Yes. So it's not exactly on the question, but it follows directly on what Maria said is that so I was one of two in aerospace and mechanical engineering. So I understand that world too. Going back to my mom again, I grew up on a block that was mostly boys when I was in kindergarten. So and my mama brought me up to believe that no boy can do anything that you can't do too. So I wasn't at all afraid of the boys in my classroom. What I was afraid of was I was that little girl from Oklahoma who had, I mean, I didn't even know engineers existed. Right. So I felt so far behind, like in understanding, I felt like, the boys had their dads were in the Air Force or their dads were engineers or that sort of thing. And they had a role model to bring them there to stand up for them. And so similar to what Maria said, I was so busy trying to be a role model for myself that I didn't think a whole lot about bringing that next person forward. As I've looked back, one of the things that I thought about last night is some of this. What advice would I give to my 20-year-old self? Is you tend to think about what are the things that I did wrong,
uh,
and there's a whole lot of things that I did right. There's a whole lot of things
mhm,
that I did right.
yeah.
I was on social media not too long ago because I have a very close friend that has two young daughters that are struggling with things that I didn't struggle with, even though I struggled with different things. And I thought to myself, did we do enough? We were the kind of
Mm,
those first ones that broke through. There were only two of us. Did I do enough? Because even though I'm the odd duck, I did a whole lot of blending in, a whole lot of
mhm,
behaving the way you're supposed to behave in order to fit in and to make that next step.
mhm.
Did I speak up enough? That whole, believe me, I've been in a lot of very awkward situations. A lot of those situations where you say something, all of us women have done that. You say something and someone talks over you and you don't get to finish your thought. I've had a few allies who said, wait a minute, JoElla had a really good point. Let's let her finish. I wish I had recognized those allies a little bit better. I wish I had been more of an ally. And like I said, I worried, did we do enough? And what I convinced myself is that we took the steps, right? We may have blended in, but we did what we needed to do in the environment that we were in. And we're still here and we're still standing and we're doing these podcasts and we're telling people that it's possible and, trying to be that ally. So, like I said, there were a lot of things that I worried, did we do enough? And I hope that we did. I hope that we opened doors. But, could we have been better? There are so many opportunities. I could have been a lot better, but I think we didn't like totally suck at it. We're still here. Go ahead, Mark.
May I add on an additional point on that? Because
Absolutely.
in the first month that I was in the industry, I was the only woman in an all male group. In fact, the only women who were at that site were secretaries. I was the only female engineer. I was very young. Everyone else was much older than me. And there were an awful lot of retired military in the group as well who are now on their second careers. And so, one of the things that would happen in those first few weeks and months of my being a part of that group is that one of the men would cuss. And when one of the men would cuss, it's as if they all remembered that there was a woman in the room and all of their faces would swivel towards me. And all of a sudden, I'd be looking back at all these faces looking at me to see what my response was going to be to a man having used a swear word in the presence of a woman. And at first, like Joella said, I just wanted to blend in. I didn't want to be the focus of that othering attention. Because at that moment, I didn't feel like a fellow engineer. I didn't even feel like the youngest member in the room. I felt like I'm a lady person and everyone's looking at me because they're afraid I'm going to faint because someone said the F word. And eventually, I realized that I was going to need to have a response for that because it kept happening and it kept disrupting the flow of conversation about what we were talking about. And so the next time that it happened and the gentleman involved said, "Pardon my French, ma'am," I said, "No, no, no, that's not French. That's Gaelic. It sounds like two bodies slapping together. It's an onomatopoeia. Get it effing straight." And in that moment, everyone in the room laughed, that sort of relieved laughter of, okay, she's not upset, she's not offended, and clearly she's not going to go to HR because she just used that word herself. And I was telling that story years later when I realized that if there had been a woman or another man who came to that group after me who wasn't comfortable with the level of swearing that was there, actions to show that I was just one of the guys and I could give as good as I got as far as swearing was concerned, may have actually made that environment worse for someone who wasn't comfortable with that because, on top of everyone feeling like that person was different from them, they might have said something like, "Well, Maria didn't have a problem with it. What's your problem, Jeff?" And now, what I wish I had done differently, and what I will absolutely do if I ever find myself in the same situation, is to still joke about it and then to end it with, "But we're supposed to be professionals here, Bob.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
consider leaving that in the locker room," and then changing the subject.
Absolutely. Those are great reflections. So let's get a little bit more real. What's the single most important lesson you'd share with yourself about building a STEM career? And you both have kind of touched on it, but a little bit deeper. Well, what are your thoughts?
I guess the one thing that, like I said, going a little bit deeper with regards to, like I said, looking back and like I said, I tend to think about all the things that I did wrong. And it was like, give yourself some credit for all the things that I did right.
Yeah.
Like I said, taking the risks, being patient. One of the struggles I have to admit that I have going on right now with a lot of our early career people is they want it and they want it right now. And part of it is it's not just being patient with regards to what I would say paying your dues. But for example, my son was recently getting an apartment and he asked me for help on the application because I had experience. And it was like, honey, it's been 30 something years since I got an apartment, And so it's like, but so I really don't know how to fill out that application. But what I do have is 30 years of experience doing things I don't know how to do. Right. So we sat down and in 5 minutes, I said, okay, the answers to all of those questions are no or zero, and you're going to get denied. And don't worry about that. Right. Because mom's going to come in and I use
Right.
that just as an analogy of that. I worry that some of this wanting it right now
Mm,
is even if it's available to you, are you ready for it? Part of it is just living and experiencing and doing things and taking challenges and the thing about figuring out what you're not meant to do. Figuring out what you're not meant to do is just as important as figuring out what you are meant to do. I once promoted someone. He really, really, he felt that the only way to get to the next level was to move into management. And
mm,
let me say something on that in just a moment. And we promoted him and he was good at it, but he was not great at it because it was not where he belonged. And he was there a year or so and went back into the technical world and has now won an Emmy.
wow.
Okay.
Wow.
It was like, instead of being program manager, he's walked the red carpet. You know what I mean? So we made the right decision. We did the absolute right thing for him to step back and to not do the thing that he thought. And on the question you asked about STEM and what we wish I understood more about STEM and that sort of thing is that I think so many people think that the only way forward is through management. And I think right now
Mm,
in the industry, like chief engineer, right? I mean, that person is powerful. In our company, there are, you know, people at the level, it's like when they speak, people listen. You know what I mean? And they're not in management. They don't lead any person,
right.
but they've moved forward by being that person, the person who has the depth and experience of knowledge, who's done the things and experienced the things and seen the failures and seen the successes and knows the root cause behind both. There are root causes between why you fail, but also behind why you succeed.
Exactly.
So there are just so many directions you could go, and they're all based on that learning experience of just living and just being in your career and like I said, figuring out what you're good at and also what you're not good at, where you don't belong. Because it's that whole if you try to sit at a table where you don't belong, maybe it's a table you know what I mean? It's that there are those tables you need to pull your chair up and you need to sit in it and you need to own it and you need to create space for others. And then there are those tables that you just really don't belong at. And it may be for many different reasons. At one point in my career, I worked for someone. I just worked for someone. Let's just say, and it's like going back and looking at it, when a job starts to change who you are as a person,
Mm,
you don't belong there. I would go home
Yeah.
every day and I was not proud of myself and I did not belong there. And so what you were saying, Maria, about the successes and the failures, that failure was really, really important to me. I did not belong in that environment. I was not happy there. I was not successful there. And it wasn't the work, it was the environment. And sometimes that's just
Yeah.
as important. And removing yourself from that environment is sort of like what Maria's, it's, I am not accepting this environment. You know what I mean? And that then maybe makes it less acceptable for the next person who comes along. It's like I'm not accepting this environment. I also
Yep.
did have a boss one time that, essentially told me that how I should behave, and essentially it was to look pretty and be quiet. And I'm sorry, but that's not why I went to engineering school, and that's not who I am, and I don't want that. And if that's what it takes to succeed, that's not what I want. I want something different.
Exactly.
So
And you
so yeah,
bring a point
so
there that,
those things.
like, you need to remove yourself from the environment if that's not what that supports who you are, just like we would pick our community or our friends or the people that we engage with that makes us feel a certain way and good about ourselves and ready to go and tackle any problem, and as a team be part of that team and go tackle that hill, right, take that hill and go beyond that. So I really like that you said that's really important. Maria, anything you want to add?
Yes. Sorry. One of the things that you mentioned was the engineer who thought the only way to succeed was through management.
Mm.
And that struck a memory in me, both of being that impatient engineer, wanting to at least be able to lead the technical project. I mean, why? I've been here a whole year. Why hasn't anyone put me in charge of anything yet? You sweet summer child. But also remembering the words of now CEO, Kathy Warden, who, when asked about the timing of moving from a technical background to more of a managerial background, said something along the lines of, I recommend that you stay technical for as long as you possibly can in your career, even if you ultimately see yourself as a senior leader in a people leadership role rather than necessarily a technical leadership role. And the reason for that is that while it may be relatively easy for someone with ambition and skill to rise quickly through the ranks of management, you'll be able to go farther if you've had more technical experiences and more different technical experiences, because once you are higher up in any organization, it's much more difficult to make that lateral move to gain the diversity of experiences that you need for the next level. So if you want to go far, stay technical as long as you can.
Good advice.
That's interesting, interesting point. Yeah. So, knowing what you know now, has your definition of success changed over the years?
Oh, don't know that I've ever had a set definition of success, but at this point, yes. Previously, my definition of success was very individual. It was my success, right? It was what accolades do I have? What promotions have I gotten? What salary, do I have? And as I have achieved my individual goals or haven't, there have been some that definitely are on my failure resume rather than my success resume. I've learned more and more to take joy and feel success in how people that I've mentored, either in a traditional sense or as a peer mentor, people that I've advised, people that I've supported, how they have succeeded. And it isn't necessarily, again, in, what titles they have or what salaries they have, but how much they light up when they're doing what they're doing. And so my definition of success may have at one point been, well, I want to lead the project and I want to go ever upwards and greater roles of responsibility. Now for me, it's really about, can I make a difference where I am? Do I have enough influence to be able to make the better system, to be able to make the organization better than it was, to leave a lasting mark in a good way so that way people don't say, Maria, thank goodness she's gone.
So I guess, like I said, my my little girl world didn't have a whole lot of what I would consider, that shining star for what you would look at for success, other than, my grandfather owned his own business. He owned his own home. All those kind of things. It was like, that's what it looked like to have made it. I guess in a way, the traditional, it meant money, meant, in my world, it meant, they say money can't buy happiness, but it sure can buy peace of mind, is what I say. It can buy a certain amount of safety, the idea that you have insurance and that you have, you don't have to worry about where you're going to live next year, or those kind of things. But so I guess from that point of view, there was always a level of, like your own home and your own space and, money to go on vacation, or whatever that was. And, but I think I reached my own sort of perfect level of success in a few ways. And part of that is just being grateful along the way, being grateful at each step. But since the time I was a little girl, I always wanted to have a family. It was very, very important to me. So when I decided to go in this world of STEM and become an engineer, and you see these, in the old time TV shows where the dad works all the time and is never home. And it's like, the kid, he's like, you hardly ever see him. And so, how was that going to work? How was that going to be balanced? I do work too hard. I work too many hours. I still do. But I've raised two children along the way. I made choices. I made many, many choices. They were important to me. Once again, the same boss who told me the other things he said one day, "JoElla, your desire not to travel has impacted your career." And I wanted to say, I never thought of that. Where, I knew as I was making those choices, I don't want to do international travel. I don't want to be away from my family. I don't want to be an astronaut. I don't want to go into space for 6 months. It was super important to me. And so I made choices along the way. I made choices to balance my career. At one point in my career, my boss, when they offered me the program manager job, I said, I have one problem. I said, I will get the work done for you, but I want to be at every basketball game, not just some of them, every one of them. And
Yeah.
she said, you put them on your calendar and I will treat them like any other meeting. And, maybe a little bit of advice, believe me, that whole idea that you can have it all, you can't have it all. I had to make choices. Maybe I could have been a little further in what you would call a quote successful career if
Yeah.
I had not gone to every basketball game. But my definition of success would not have included missing those events. So,
Yeah.
so my definition of success maybe looked a little different from somebody else's. And believe me, I have driven across town, watch a basketball game, travel across town, watch a basketball game, travel across town, and then work until 2 o'clock in the morning, because that's what I needed for my definition of success, was to
Success.
be able to do both of those things and to make them work. But the whole concept of you can have it all, you can't. And the other thing, I guess, with regards to that is, all of these walking through doors or making the decisions to go to basketball games and those kind of things, is every day we make the very best decision that we could make based on the information that we have. And that applies to your life. That applies to engineering. You sit at a
Yeah.
table and you listen to a bunch of people give their inputs and you make the very best decision that you can make. And 20 years later, you look back on that decision and you can judge it. But on that day and time,
Yeah.
and so like I said, I thought last night, it was like, as I look back 20 years at myself, you tend to want to look at all the things you did wrong. I think making the choices to be at those basketball games and balance my career and still be an engineer and do all of those things was exactly right for me. And I wouldn't have done it any differently.
I love that. I love all of that and all of that reflection. It's a reminder that careers are marathons and not sprints. So let's finish with a few rapid fire reflections if we
Okay.
can. So, what is one word that describes how you felt about your career at 20?
Scared.
Excited. I was
Okay, so one of
torn
you said
between
scared, one
saying
of you said
excited and
excited.
scared.
Excitedly scared. How's
But
that?
I think the
that's
whole
what
idea
excitement
of
is.
if you're not scared, you're not reaching. You're not reaching high enough. So I think it's the same
Absolutely.
thing. Super excited, but also frightened.
Yep. Absolutely. All right. Number 2. One thing you're grateful your 20-ish-year-old self didn't know.
How hard
All,
it would be.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I was
Yep.
grateful I was a little naive and just super excited and ready for what was coming.
Yep. If we knew then what we know now, right?
all of the people barriers that could exist to keep what was technically the best outcome from happening, and how often the best technical solution is not chosen because of things that have absolutely nothing to do with engineering. If I had known that early on, I probably would have been too discouraged. As it was, I learned it in the right point in my career where I could just view that as another dimension of the problem to solve.
Excellent. So, okay, last rapid fire. One motto or mindset that keeps you going today.
So I guess the mindset, and I tell our interns that come in, is you can see just by my facial expressions, is that I love what I do. I'm excited by what I do. And if you can keep that attitude and not get bogged down, believe me, I sit in meetings, I process paperwork, I deal with people's problems. The first of the year, all of our charge numbers were broken. And then I remembered that I worked for NASA, or I do things in human space flight. And what I do is a privilege, and I'm excited about it. I've stood on the grass. I've watched that rocket go. I've stood on the grass and I watched that rocket go, and people's hopes and dreams are there. So all of this that we talked about, it was hard. It was also amazing. And it's so much easier to come to work when you have that attitude. So keep it.
Yes.
Truly. I think for me, one of the things that I ask myself is, what can I uniquely bring to this? Because at this point in my career, there are others who may have a greater domain knowledge. May have greater familiarity with the customer set. There's usually something about the way that I view things where I am that odd duck who has the different way of maybe bringing things together that no one else might do, that I'm always trying to figure out, not how can I be another cog in this machine? And sometimes I have to be, sometimes it's a matter of getting those charge numbers to actually work in the system, right? But what is the value that I uniquely bring here, and how can I communicate that in a way that others can see? So, why am I here is the short version of that.
What a powerful and heartfelt conversation. Thank you both for sharing your journeys and reflections so openly.
You're welcome.
Such a
Thank
pleasure
you.
to be here, Gabby. Thank you.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this. Thank you so much for including us.
I think today's discussion reminds us that there is no single path in STEM, and that the lessons we learn along the way are often more valuable than the ones we planned for. Thanks for listening to Keys to the Future. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep unlocking your future. Thanks to my guests, JoElla Delheimer and Maria Grundmann. Thank you to Roger Coe for quality reviews. And thanks to Jill always.